A lone wild horse with a mysterious past and a weathered leather satchel clutched in its teeth. A hardened farmer who had given up on humanity years ago. When these two unlikely souls cross paths in Montana's unforgiving wilderness, neither could anticipate the astonishing chain of events that would follow. What that horse carried and why will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the animal kingdom. This isn't just another animal rescue story. This is about a debt repaid in the most extraordinary way imaginable. Ethan Miller hadn't always been a recluse. There was a time when the 53-year-old had been the life of Pinewood, known for his hearty laugh and generous spirit. But that was before the accident, before his wife's passing, before he'd watched his prized horses scattered to auction blocks across 3 states when the bank foreclosed on his family's breeding operation. 3 years later, he'd scraped together enough to buy this small parcel in Paradise Valley, just 40 acres of rocky soil and scattered pines, with a cabin that leaked when it rained and creaked when the wind blew. It wasn't much, but it was his, and more importantly, it was far from prying eyes and pitying glances. His only companion these days was Rusty, an aging cattle dog with a limp in his back leg and more loyalty than sense. Together, they maintained their simple existence, tending to Ethan's meager vegetable garden, fixing endless sections of dilapidated fence, and occasionally making the 20-mile journey into Pinewood for supplies. Ethan had exactly 1 horse now, an old quarter-horse mare named Penny who was more retired than working. She'd been his last purchase before everything fell apart, and he hadn't the heart to sell her even when the cupboards ran bare last winter. That crisp October morning started like any other. Ethan woke before dawn, his joints protesting as he swung his legs over the side of his bed. The cabin was cold. He'd need to start chopping more firewood soon. Winter came early to Paradise Valley, and it never arrived gently. He pulled on his worn flannel shirt, stepping carefully over Rusty, who barely opened one eye to acknowledge his master's movements. After a simple breakfast of coffee and toast, Ethan pulled on his boots and stepped out onto the porch, inhaling the sharp, pine-scented air as the first rays of sunlight crested the Gallatin Range. Something was different. Penny was agitated in her small corral, pacing the fence line and nickering softly. Rusty, now fully awake, stood at attention beside Ethan, a low growl building in his throat. Ethan narrowed his eyes, scanning the tree line at the edge of his property where the wilderness began. The shadows shifted, and then he saw it, a horse, wild and magnificent, standing just beyond the pines. Even from this distance, Ethan could tell this wasn't some neighbor's escaped mount. This was a Mustang, its dark, dappled coat unmarked by saddle or bridle, its mane wind-tangled and free. Ethan had seen wild horses before. Occasionally they passed through these parts, though they typically gave human settlements a wide berth. But this one seemed to be watching him, its dark eyes unnervingly focused. More curious than concerned, Ethan stepped off the porch. The wild horse stamped once, but held its ground. As Ethan slowly approached, he noticed something strange. The horse appeared to be carrying something in its mouth. At first, he thought it might be forage, but the object was too regular in shape, too obviously man-made. "Easy there," Ethan murmured, keeping his voice low and steady. He'd spent most of his life around horses. He knew better than to make sudden movements around a wild one. The Mustang, a stallion he could now see, tossed his head, eyes never leaving Ethan's. There was something unnerving about that gaze, something almost indeliberate. Ethan was now close enough to see what the horse was carrying, a small leather satchel, weathered and worn, its strap clutched firmly between powerful teeth. The stallion took a tentative step forward, then another. Ethan stood perfectly still, barely breathing. This close, he could see the scars that marked the Mustang's muscular chest, the healed gash above one eye. This horse had seen trouble, survived hardship, Something in Ethan recognized a kindred spirit. The Mustang stopped about 10 feet away, nostrils flaring as he assessed this human standing before him. Then, with a deliberate motion that Ethan would replay in his mind countless times in the days to come, the wild horse lowered his head and dropped the leather satchel onto the ground. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the stallion backed up several paces, shook his magnificent head, and stood watching, waiting. It was the strangest thing Ethan had ever experienced, almost as if the horse wanted him to take the satchel. Carefully, never taking his eyes off the Mustang, Ethan crouched down and reached for the abandoned item. The leather was cracked with age and exposure, but the clasp still held. The wild horse continued to watch, showing no signs of fleeing, no signs of aggression. With cautious fingers, Ethan opened the satchel. Inside was a sealed waterproof container, the kind hikers use to protect valuables. His brow furrowed in confusion as he popped open the plastic lid. What he found inside made his breath catch. A wallet, a compass, a tarnished wedding ring, and a laminated identification card bearing the photo of a man who had gone missing in these mountains over 5 months ago. Ethan's head snapped up, eyes meeting the Mustang's steady gaze. "What is this?" he whispered, though he knew the horse couldn't answer. "Where did you get these?" The stallion stomped once, turned, and began walking slowly back toward the tree line. After a few paces, he stopped and looked back at Ethan, as if checking to see if the human was following. The message couldn't have been clearer if the horse had spoken aloud. "Come with me." Ethan Miller had spent the last 3 years avoiding other people, avoiding complications, avoiding anything that might force him to care again. But something about this wild horse's determined gaze broke through walls he'd thought impenetrable. With a curse under his breath that was half resignation and half disbelief at what he was about to do, Ethan whistled for Rusty, ran back to the cabin for his rifle, a canteen, and a first aid kit, and then hurried to Penny's corral. The mare seemed to sense the urgency, standing still as Ethan quickly saddled her. By the time he swung up into the saddle, the wild stallion had moved farther into the trees but remained visible, waiting. Ethan knew he should call Sheriff Jenkins, report the found items, let professionals handle whatever this was. Instead, he nudged Penny forward, following the Mustang, who seemed intent on leading him somewhere. The sensible part of Ethan's mind, the part that had kept him safely isolated these past years, was screaming that this was madness. But another voice, one that had been silent for too long, whispered that sometimes the greatest moments in life come from following the unexpected path. The wild stallion, whom Ethan had mentally dubbed Phantom for his ghostly appearance from the wilderness, set a deliberate pace. Not too fast that Penny couldn't keep up, but with obvious purpose. They traveled deeper into the Eagle Creek wilderness than Ethan had ventured in years, following game trails that wound through increasingly dense forest. Rusty trotted alongside, occasionally ranging ahead, but always returning, his earlier wariness of the wild horse replaced by an almost businesslike focus on their strange journey. After nearly 2 hours, the trees thinned and they emerged onto a rocky ledge. Below stretched a hidden valley, the kind of place that wouldn't appear on most maps. A small tributary of Silver Creek cut through its center, and the late morning sun illuminated patches of grass still green despite the advancing season. Phantom paused at the edge, looking back at Ethan with those intelligent eyes, then began picking his way down a narrow trail that switched back to the valley floor. Ethan hesitated only briefly before following. Penny was sure-footed despite her age, but he dismounted to lead her down the steepest sections, his mind racing with questions. Why had this wild horse brought him these items? What could possibly await them in this secluded valley? The rational explanations that the horse had simply found the satchel somewhere, that this was all bizarre coincidence, felt hollow against the deliberate way Phantom had sought him out, had waited for him to follow. They reached the valley floor, and Phantom increased his pace, leading them along the creek bank toward a cluster of boulders and fallen logs. As they drew closer, Ethan noticed something unnatural about the arrangement, almost like a crude shelter fashioned from the natural materials. His heart began to pound. He tied Penny to a nearby tree, motioned for Rusty to stay, and approached on foot, one hand resting on his rifle, though he didn't draw it. "Hello?" he called out, feeling foolish but unable to shake the sense that they weren't alone. "Anyone there?" At first, silence answered him, broken only by the gentle babble of the creek and the occasional stamp of Phantom's hoof as the wild horse watched from a short distance. Then, so faint he almost missed it, a sound, a human sound, emerged from the makeshift shelter. Ethan rushed forward, pushing aside branches that partially concealed the entrance to what he now saw was indeed a deliberate shelter, albeit a crude one. Inside, lying on a bed of pine boughs, was a man, gaunt, bearded, his clothes tattered but unmistakably alive. The man's eyes widened at the sight of Ethan, cracked lips parting in disbelief. "Real?" the man croaked, one trembling hand reaching out. "You're real?" "I'm real," Ethan confirmed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Already shrugging off his pack to retrieve his canteen. "James Harrington?" he asked, recalling the name from the ID in the satchel. The man nodded weakly, accepting the water Ethan offered with shaking hands. After a few careful sips, he found his voice again. How did you find me? I've been stranded here for months, fell during a solo hike, broke my leg." He gestured to his lower body, where Ethan now noticed the crude splint fashioned from branches and strips of clothing. "No one knew my route. My phone was dead, I thought. I was sure I would die here." Ethan glanced back toward where Phantom stood watching. "You're not going to believe this, but a horse found me. A wild horse. Brought me your things." James's eyes widened further, and to Ethan's surprise, the injured man began to laugh, a weak, wheezing sound that nonetheless held genuine amazement. The dapple grey, with the scar above his eye? When Ethan nodded, James shook his head in wonder. "He's been keeping me alive." Over the next hour, as Ethan assessed James's condition and radioed for emergency help using the satellite communicator he'd brought along, the injured hiker shared his extraordinary tale. After his fall had left him with a compound fracture, James had managed to drag himself to this spot, where the natural features offered some shelter. He'd expected to die within days, but then the wild Mustang had appeared. "At first, I thought he was going to trample me," James explained between careful sips of water. "Wild horses don't exactly seek out human company, but he just watched me. Came back the next day, and the next. Then one day, he brought me apples, actual apples. Must have found them at some abandoned homestead. After that, he'd bring me berries, edible plants, almost like he knew what I could eat." James gestured weakly toward the creek. "He'd come stand here every day watching me. It was like he was checking on me. When I got strong enough to drag myself to the water, he'd actually stand guard. I've seen him chase off a mountain lion. Can you believe that? Without him..." James's voice broke. "Without him, I would have died weeks ago." Ethan listened, torn between skepticism and wonder. As a lifelong horseman, he knew horses were intelligent, capable of forming strong bonds. But this level of apparent deliberate help toward a stranger, a human no less, it defied explanation. Yet the evidence was right before him. James survived months in the wilderness with a broken leg, and somehow this wild Mustang had not only helped keep him alive, but had then sought out another human and brought him here. "But the satchel," Ethan asked. "How did he get your personal items?" James nodded toward the shelter's entrance. "About a week ago, I realized I was getting weaker, not stronger. Winter's coming. I knew I wouldn't survive it out here, so I gave him my satchel. Sounds crazy, I know, but I'd been talking to him. For months, keeps you sane when you're alone. I showed him my ID, my wife's picture in my wallet, told him to find help." James's laugh was tinged with disbelief at his own story. Never actually thought he'd understand. As if aware he was being discussed, Phantom approached the shelter, his gait cautious, but his head held high. Both men fell silent, watching, as the magnificent wild horse stopped just outside the entrance, dark eyes moving between them. There was an awareness in that gaze that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine, not of fear, but of recognition, of something profound he couldn't quite name. The rescue helicopter arrived 2 hours later, touching down in the small valley with a thunderous roar that sent birds scattering from the trees. As the emergency medical technicians loaded James onto a stretcher, Ethan stood to the side, watching. As Phantom observed from the safety of the tree line, the wild horse hadn't fled at the helicopter's approach, just retreated to a watchful distance. "You'll tell my wife?" James asked as they prepared to lift him into the helicopter. "About the horse? About what he did?" Ethan nodded, though. He wondered how much of this incredible story would be believed. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying James to safety and proper medical care, Ethan remained in the valley, unwilling to leave just yet. He approached the edge of the trees where Phantom stood. "Thank you," he said simply, feeling both foolish and profound, speaking to a wild animal as if it could understand. Maybe it was his imagination, but something in the Mustang's eyes seemed to acknowledge his words. Then Phantom turned and trotted away, disappearing into the forest like a spirit returning to the wilderness. Ethan watched until the last flash of that dappled coat vanished among the trees. Only then did he return to where Penny waited patiently, untying her reins and preparing for the journey back to his cabin. The world suddenly felt different, larger, more mysterious, but also somehow less empty. 3 weeks later, the first heavy snow blanketed Paradise Valley. Ethan had spent the intervening time giving statements to Sheriff Jenkins, speaking with search and rescue teams, and even doing one reluctant interview with the local newspaper. James was recovering in a hospital in Bozeman, his story of survival and the mysterious wild horse who saved him spreading far beyond Pinewood's borders. Most people filed it under Wilderness Miracle, a nice story where the details were less important than the happy ending. Wildlife experts offered explanations about horses' natural curiosity, about the possibility that Phantom had been previously domesticated. Ethan listened to them all and kept his own counsel. He had returned to his routine, chopping wood, repairing fences, preparing for the long winter ahead, but something had shifted inside him. He found himself looking toward the tree line more often, wondering about Phantom, wondering about the capacity for connection that existed beyond human understanding. He'd even started making occasional trips into town, stopping by the Pinewood diner, exchanging more than just necessary words with shopkeepers. Small steps, but steps nonetheless. That morning, Ethan woke to find Rusty barking excitedly at the cabin door. Half asleep, he pulled on his boots and coat, assuming the dog needed an urgent bathroom break. When he opened the door, the sight that greeted him stopped him cold. There, standing in the snow-covered yard, was Phantom. But the wild Mustang wasn't alone. Beside him stood another horse, smaller, with a lighter coat, but unmistakably a Mustang as well. And behind them, partially obscured by the falling snow, were more shapes, an entire small herd of wild horses watching cautiously from the edge of the property. Ethan stood transfixed as Phantom stepped forward, crossing the invisible boundary between wild and tame, with deliberate hoofbeats that left perfect impressions in the fresh snow. The wild horse stopped a few yards from the porch, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. For a long moment, horse and man regarded each other. Then Phantom lowered his head, pawing once at the snow, an invitation, a greeting, a choice. Slowly, Ethan descended the porch steps. He had nothing to offer. This wild creature, no food, no shelter, no protection from the harsh winter ahead. But as he cautiously extended his hand, palm up, and felt the warm breath of the Mustang against his skin, he understood that wasn't what Phantom had come for. The wild horse had brought him something more valuable than any physical object, more shocking than any revelation. He had brought connection, purpose, a bridge between two worlds that were never meant to be entirely separate. Behind them, Penny nickered softly from her shelter, and one of the wild mares answered. Rusty sat attentively at Ethan's side, his earlier barking replaced by curious observation. And Ethan Miller, who had locked himself away from life, from connection, from possibility, felt the final walls around his heart begin to crumble. When Sarah Thornton from the neighboring ranch arrived later that day to check on him after the snowstorm, she found Ethan in his pasture, quietly observing the small herd of wild horses that had inexplicably chosen to shelter there. The animals kept their distance from the humans, but showed no fear, no urgency to leave. They just showed up this morning, Ethan explained, his voice filled with wonder. Led by that one. He pointed to Phantom, who stood slightly apart from the others, still the sentinel, the guardian, the bridge. Sarah shook her head in amazement. I've never seen anything like it. Wild horses don't seek out people, Ethan. They certainly don't. Bring their herd to human property during a storm. This one's different, Ethan said simply. And as the winter deepened, the story of the wild Mustang who had saved a lost hiker and then chosen to connect with the reclusive rancher spread throughout Paradise Valley and beyond. Wildlife experts came to observe the unusual behavior. Photographers captured images of the majestic horses against the snow-covered landscape. James and his wife made the journey to Ridgeline Ranch once he was well enough to travel, meeting Ethan and seeing for themselves the remarkable animal who had orchestrated an impossible rescue. But for Ethan, the true miracle wasn't in the dramatic rescue or the newspaper headlines. It was in the quiet mornings when he would step onto his porch and see Phantom watching from the pasture, a free creature who chose, day after day, to build a bridge between worlds. It was in the gradual healing that took place as he opened his property and his life to neighbors, to visitors, eventually establishing a small sanctuary for injured and displaced wild horses. The leather satchel that Phantom had carried. To him, that October morning now hung on the wall of Ethan's cabin, a reminder that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected messengers, that intelligence, compassion, and connection transcend the boundaries we believe separate us from the natural world. That healing often begins when we're brave enough to follow where an unlikely guide leads us. And on quiet evenings, when the sanctuary visitors had gone home and the winter wind whistled through the pines, Ethan would stand at the fence line, watching Phantom's herd graze freely across his land. The wild Mustang would often approach, not for treats or handling, but simply to stand near two souls who had found in each other something neither knew they were seeking. In a world that too often separates, categorizes, and divides, they had discovered a profound truth that the most powerful connections often cross boundaries, that rescue goes both ways, and that sometimes the most shocking thing a wild heart can bring you is simply the courage to be wild again yourself. If this story touched something within you, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who understands that the most extraordinary connections often come from the most unexpected places. Because in a world that often feels divided, these moments of cross-species connection remind us of what's possible when we remain open to wonder. Spring arrived in Paradise Valley with a gentle persistence, melting the snowdrifts that had isolated Ridgeline Ranch for much of the winter, The transformation wasn't limited to the landscape. Ethan Miller stood on his newly reinforced porch, a steaming cup of coffee warming his hands as he surveyed the changes 4 months had brought to his once quiet homestead. The pasture that had previously hosted only aging Penny now accommodated a rotation of wild horses, some staying for weeks, others merely passing through for days before returning to the mountains. At the center of it all remained Phantom, his dappled coat now glossy with health, his watchful eyes maintaining that uncanny intelligence that had first brought him to Ethan's door. The small barn had been expanded with the help of neighboring ranchers who'd been drawn to the remarkable story of the Mustang who had saved a human life. What began as curious visits had evolved into genuine support once they witnessed the unusual relationship between Ethan and the wild horses. Sarah Thornton had been particularly instrumental, offering expertise from her years of ranch management and connections to local conservation groups. Her frequent visits had become something Ethan found himself looking forward to, a realization that still surprised him when he allowed himself to acknowledge it. "Morning," Sarah called as her truck rumbled up the driveway right on schedule. She stepped out wearing mud-splattered jeans and a flannel shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Brought those mineral blocks we talked about, and Dr. Wilson said he'll stop by tomorrow to check on that mare with the laceration." Ethan nodded his thanks, setting his coffee down and moving to help unload the supplies. Their easy rhythm of cooperation had developed naturally over the past months, requiring few words. It was a comfort Ethan hadn't realized he'd been missing during his years of isolation. "They're watching us again," Sarah remarked, glancing toward the pasture, where several of the wild horses had gathered along the fence line, Phantom at their center. "Still gives me chills sometimes. Never seen anything like how they observe everything we do." Ethan followed her gaze. She wasn't wrong. The wild herd, now numbering 14 when all were present, maintained a curious awareness of human activities around the property. They kept their distance from most visitors, but their attention was unmistakable. Phantom, however, had gradually allowed a small circle of humans into his confidence. Ethan, of course, Sarah after weeks of patient stillness, and most remarkably, James Harrington, who had made a full recovery and returned to thank the animal, who had orchestrated his rescue from certain death in the wilderness. "James called yesterday," Ethan said as they finished unloading. "The university researchers want to come back next week. Said they've never documented behavior like this in wild Mustangs." Sarah snorted. "Researchers. They'll study and classify and still miss the point, which is that some things can't be explained by science. Sometimes you just have to accept the mystery." Ethan might have once dismissed such sentiment as romantic nonsense. Now he found himself nodding in agreement. The past months had expanded his understanding of what was possible, of the complex intelligence that existed beyond human comprehension. He thought often of that October morning when Phantom had appeared carrying the leather satchel, an action that defied conventional understanding of equine behavior. The sophisticated problem-solving it represented still stunned wildlife experts who visited the ranch. "Mail came," Sarah said, handing him a stack of envelopes. "More letters. People who've heard the story." Ethan accepted the mail with a mixture of gratitude and discomfort. The local newspaper article about James's rescue had been picked up by national outlets, then amplified through social media. What had begun as a regional human interest story had exploded into something approaching folklore. Letters arrived daily from across the country, some sharing similar stories of animal intelligence, others asking to visit the ranch, many including donations for what was now officially named Phantom Sanctuary. The unexpected attention had forced Ethan to make decisions he'd never anticipated. With Sarah's guidance, he'd established a proper non-profit organization to manage the growing donations. They'd developed a schedule of limited public visitation, days that balanced the curiosity of outsiders with the well-being of the wild horses. Local contractors had built a small visitor center at the edge of the property, far enough from the main pastures to give the horses space, but close enough for observation. Most surprising was how Ethan had adapted to this new reality. The man who had once fled human contact now found himself explaining the sanctuary's mission to small groups of visitors, sharing the remarkable story that had started it all, and, even on occasion, conducting interviews with documentary filmmakers and journalists who continued to be fascinated by Phantom's seemingly impossible actions. "There's something else," Sarah said, hesitation in her voice as she pulled a particular envelope from her pocket. "This came to my address, addressed to you." Ethan accepted the envelope, noting the official letterhead of the Bureau of Land Management. His stomach tightened as he scanned the contents. The BLM was planning an emergency roundup of wild horses in the Eagle Creek region due to drought conditions and overpopulation concerns. The letter, directed to him as the operator of a recognized equine sanctuary, offered the opportunity to adopt some of the captured mustangs before they entered the general adoption system. "Convenient timing," he muttered, passing the letter back to Sarah. "Create a problem, then offer us the chance to help fix it." "It's not that simple," Sarah countered, though her expression showed she shared some of his frustration. "The drought is real. Grazing land is limited. Without natural predators, the wild herds do grow beyond what the land can sustainably support. So we chase them with helicopters? Separate families that have been together for generations?" "I'm not defending the methods," Sarah said quietly. "I'm saying the problem is real, and this might be an opportunity to help some of those horses." Ethan ran a hand through his graying hair, gaze drifting to where Phantom now stood alert at the fence, as if sensing the tension in their conversation. The wild stallion had transformed Ethan's life, had shown him a depth of intelligence and connection he'd never imagined possible. The thought of other mustangs being rounded up, terrified by thundering helicopters and roaring engines, separated from their families and confined in holding pens, it twisted something deep in his chest. "When?" he asked finally. "2 weeks. They're giving advance notice to ranchers in the area." Ethan nodded slowly, a plan already forming. "We should talk to James and that wildlife photographer who visited last month, Alicia. They both have connections that might help." Sarah's smile held a hint of pride. Already thinking like an activist, not bad for a man who wanted nothing to do with people a few months ago. Ethan wouldn't have described himself as an activist, but he couldn't deny how thoroughly his priorities had shifted. Before Phantom, he'd wanted only to be left alone with his grief and disillusionment. Now, he found himself entangled in a growing network of relationships, with Sarah, with James and his wife, with the visitors who came to learn about the sanctuary, and most profoundly, with the wild horses themselves. He'd stepped back into the world and found it both more complex and more wondrous than he remembered. As if reading his thoughts, Sarah reached out and briefly squeezed his arm, a gesture of solidarity that would have been unthinkable months ago but now felt natural. "We'll figure something out," she assured him. "The roundup may be inevitable, but how it happens, what becomes of the horses afterward, we can influence that." Ethan nodded, his gaze returning to Phantom. The wild stallion had moved closer to the fence, his intelligent eyes fixed on the humans, as if he understood every word of their conversation. Perhaps he did. Ethan had long since stopped underestimating what this remarkable animal could comprehend. "We need to tell them," he said finally. "The herd. Phantom. They should know what's coming." Sarah didn't laugh or dismiss the suggestion as irrational. After months of witnessing the unusual communication between Ethan and the wild horses, particularly Phantom, she simply nodded. "Tonight then, when it's quiet. That evening, as the setting sun painted Paradise Valley in hues of amber and gold, Ethan walked alone to the pasture fence. The wild horses had gathered for their evening grazing, moving through the spring grass with unhurried precision. They maintained their social structure even in the semi-domesticated setting of the sanctuary. Mares with their foals at the center, younger stallions at the periphery, and Phantom moving among them like a benevolent overseer. Ethan approached slowly, respecting the unspoken boundaries that had developed between them. He never entered the pasture without permission. A subtle shift in the herd's energy, an acknowledging look from Phantom. Tonight, that permission came quickly. The dappled stallion raised his head, regarded Ethan for a moment, then moved deliberately toward the fence. The other horses continued grazing, but Ethan knew they were aware, observing even as they appeared focused on the sweet spring grass. "They're coming," Ethan said simply when Phantom stood before him, separated only by the wooden fence rails. 2 weeks from now, government helicopters, they'll try to round up wild horses from the Eagle Creek region. He felt slightly foolish speaking so directly to an animal, but months of interaction had convinced him that Phantom grasped far more than conventional wisdom suggested possible. The stallion's ears flicked forward, his dark eyes fixed on Ethan's, faced with that unnerving intelligence that still sometimes sent chills down his spine. "I don't know if your family is in that area," Ethan continued, "but I thought you should know. We're going to try to help, to make sure any horses they capture are treated well, to adopt as many as we can here at the sanctuary." He paused, then added softly, "I wish I could stop it entirely." Phantom remained motionless, processing. Then he did something that still had the power to astonish Ethan, despite months of unusual interactions. The wild stallion deliberately turned his head toward the mountains visible in the distance, then back to Ethan, then again toward the mountains. The message couldn't have been clearer if he'd spoken aloud. "There are others there. My kind." "I know," Ethan acknowledged. "We'll do everything we can." For a long moment, horse and man regarded each other in the fading light. Then Phantom lowered his head briefly, almost a nod, before turning and trotting back to his herd. Ethan watched him go, the familiar sense of wonder washing over him. Even after all these months, the depth of understanding between them felt like a gift he'd done nothing to deserve. As darkness settled over the valley, Ethan walked back to his cabin where Sarah waited on the porch, 2 steaming mugs in hand. He accepted the coffee gratefully, settling into the chair beside her. Their shoulders almost touched, another small intimacy that had developed naturally over time. "Did you tell him?" she asked, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. "I did. And?" Ethan sipped his coffee, organizing his thoughts. He understood, I'm certain of it, the way he looked toward the mountains. He trailed off, still sometimes reluctant to articulate the full extent of what he believed Phantom comprehended. Sarah nodded, requiring no further explanation. She'd witnessed enough of the unusual communication between man and horse to accept possibilities that would have seemed absurd to her a year ago. The question is, what will he do with the information? It was a question that lingered in Ethan's mind as he tried to sleep that night, and one that was dramatically answered shortly after dawn the next morning. The sound of Rusty's urgent barking pulled Ethan from a restless sleep. He threw on clothes and rushed outside to find Sarah already there, having arrived for her usual morning visit. She stood transfixed at the edge of the driveway, staring toward the pasture. "Ethan," she said quietly as he approached, "look." The sight that greeted him stole his breath. The sanctuary's regular herd was gathered near the fence, but they weren't alone. Beyond them, spilling out of the tree line and across the meadow, were dozens of wild horses. Mustangs of every color, bays, sorrels, pintos, blacks, moved in coordinated groups under the first light of dawn. At the center of it all was Phantom, moving between the newly arrived horses and the sanctuary residents, his purpose unmistakable. Even to human eyes, he was making introductions, establishing connections, building something. "My God," Sarah whispered. "There must be 50 of them. Where did they come from?" "Eagle Creek," Ethan said with certainty. "The herds that will be rounded up, he brought them here." "That's impossible," Sarah murmured, but there was no conviction in her voice. They had long since moved beyond what seemed possible or impossible where Phantom was concerned. As they watched, the wild stallion detached himself from the herd and approached the fence. His gaze locked with Ethan's, and the message was unmistakable. "I've brought them to you. Protect them." Ethan felt the weight of that trust settle onto his shoulders, a responsibility he would never have sought, yet could not refuse. Beside him, Sarah seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. "We'll need more land," she said pragmatically, her mind already working through logistics. "More water sources. The north pasture at my place could be opened up, and there's that foreclosed property adjacent to yours that the bank's been trying to unload." Ethan barely heard her. He was focused on the extraordinary scene before him. Dozens of wild Mustangs who had voluntarily approached human habitation, led by a stallion who had somehow conveyed to them that this place offered safety. The unlikely sanctuary that had begun with one horse bringing a leather satchel had transformed into something far more significant than Ethan could have imagined. The following days passed in a blur of activity. News of the sudden influx of wild horses spread quickly through Paradise Valley. Neighbors who had already been supportive of the sanctuary rallied with remarkable generosity. The adjacent property was purchased within days through an emergency fundraising campaign spearheaded by James Harrington, who leveraged his newfound minor celebrity to attract donations. Temporary water systems were established, additional fencing was constructed at record speed with volunteer labor. Dr. Wilson, the local veterinarian, brought colleagues from Bozeman to conduct health assessments on the new arrivals, many of whom allowed human approach with surprising tolerance once they observed Phantom's acceptance of certain people. The wild horses maintained their distance from most humans, but they didn't flee. They seemed to understand they had entered into an unusual covenant, safety in exchange for proximity to the human world they would normally avoid. Wildlife biologists and horse behavior experts descended on the sanctuary, drawn by reports of behavior that defied conventional understanding of wild Mustangs. Their scientific observations confirmed what Ethan and Sarah already knew. Something extraordinary was happening at Ridgeline Ranch. The coordinated arrival of multiple family bands of wild horses, apparently led by a single stallion, represented a level of communication and social complexity previously undocumented in equine populations. Amidst this controlled chaos, BLM officials arrived, drawn by reports that dozens of wild horses from the planned roundup area had mysteriously relocated. Their initial skepticism gave way to astonishment as they witnessed the unusual sanctuary. Ethan had established wild horses who remained wild yet accepted limited human presence, who had apparently chosen this protected space over their traditional ranges. "I've never seen anything like it," admitted Regional Director Harmon, a career bureaucrat whose usual detachment had been shaken by the scene before him. "These horses should be running from us, not—" He gestured toward where several Mustangs grazed calmly despite the visitors at the observation area. "Tolerating our presence like this. They know they're safe here," Ethan said simply. Director Harmon shook his head in wonder. "The roundup is still necessary in other areas. The drought conditions—" "I understand," Ethan interrupted, "but these horses have already relocated themselves to protected land with sustainable water sources. Would you consider canceling the operation for the Eagle Creek region specifically? The problem you needed to solve has effectively solved itself." The bureaucratic wrangling that followed stretched over days, involving multiple agencies, emergency permits, and hastily arranged inspections. Throughout it all, the wild horses remained, adapting to their new home with remarkable ease. Phantom moved between the various family bands, his role as intermediary between the wild herds and the human sanctuary operators becoming increasingly clear to even the most skeptical observers. 10 days after the horses' arrival, Director Harmon returned with his decision. The Eagle Creek Roundup would be modified to exclude the eastern section where most of the horses had originated. Additionally, the BLM would officially recognize Phantom's Sanctuary as a protected Mustang habitat, eligible for certain conservation funds and legal protections. This isn't standard procedure, Harmon admitted as he delivered the news to Ethan and Sarah. But nothing about this situation is standard. Whatever's happening here, he gestured toward where Phantom stood watching their meeting from a respectful distance. It deserves study and respect. That evening, with the immediate crisis averted and the future of the sanctuary more secure than it had been, Ethan found a moment of quiet reflection. He sat on his porch steps as twilight settled over Paradise Valley, watching the expanded herd of wild horses move across pastures that had been empty just months before. Sarah had gone home to check on her own ranch, promising to return later with dinner. The property was momentarily quiet, free from the researchers, volunteers, and visitors who had filled it in recent days. Movement at the edge of his vision drew his attention. Phantom had separated from the herd and was approaching the cabin with deliberate steps. The dappled stallion stopped a respectful distance away, regarding Ethan with those intelligent eyes that had changed the course of so many lives. "You knew, didn't you?" Ethan asked softly. "You knew what would happen to those horses if they stayed." Phantom's ears flicked forward, his gaze unwavering. "How did you convince them to follow you here? How did you know they'd be safe?" The questions had no answers, at least none that could be expressed in human language. Yet as Ethan looked into those knowing eyes, he felt understood in a way that transcended words. This remarkable animal had built a bridge between worlds that were never meant to be fully separate, had recognized in Ethan a kindred spirit who would honor that connection. Slowly, with deliberate dignity, Phantom took several steps closer, close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth of his breath in the cool evening air. It was the nearest the wild stallion had voluntarily come to him outside the pasture boundaries. Then, in a gesture that brought unexpected moisture to Ethan's eyes, Phantom lowered his proud head and gently pressed his forehead against Ethan's chest. The touch lasted only seconds before the stallion stepped back, tossed his head, and turned to trot back to his herd. But its meaning resonated in Ethan's heart with the clarity of spoken words: trust, partnership, gratitude. As Phantom rejoined the wild horses grazing in the golden light of sunset, Ethan remained on the porch steps, humbled by the responsibility he'd been given and the trust he'd been shown. His life had been utterly transformed in ways he could never have predicted that October morning, when a wild horse appeared carrying a leather satchel. What had begun as one remarkable act of apparent intelligence and compassion had expanded into something that challenged human understanding of wild animals and their capacity for complex thought and social organization. The sound of Sarah's truck coming up the driveway pulled him from his reverie. She stepped out carrying a basket that promised home-cooked food, her smile warm with the familiarity that had developed between them over months of shared purpose. As she approached, her gaze moved beyond him to where Phantom had rejoined his herd. "Everything okay?" she asked, settling beside him on the steps. Ethan nodded, finding no adequate words to describe the moment he just shared with the wild stallion. But Sarah seemed to understand anyway, her hand finding his in the gathering darkness. "James called," she said after a comfortable silence. "The documentary crew wants to start filming next week, if that's still all right with you." Ethan nodded, initially reluctant about the documentary project. He'd come to see its value in sharing the remarkable story of Phantom Sanctuary with a wider audience. The Wild Mustang's demonstration of intelligence, compassion, and social complexity deserved documentation, not to satisfy human curiosity, but to inspire greater protection for these magnificent animals and the wild places they called home. "They're calling it the messenger," Sarah continued, focused on how Phantom has changed our understanding of wild horse cognition and communication. "Appropriate," Ethan acknowledged, his gaze drawn back to where the dappled stallion now stood silhouetted against the sunset, his proud head raised as he surveyed his expanded herd. Messenger indeed, between wilderness and civilization, between human and animal understanding, between what was known and what remained mysterious. As night settled over Paradise Valley, lights began to glow in the visitor center at the edge of the property and in the small cabin that housed the sanctuary's volunteer coordinator. What had once been Ethan's isolated refuge had transformed into a community united by purpose, protecting the remarkable wild horses that had chosen to trust them. The irony wasn't lost on him. In seeking isolation, he had ultimately found connection more profound than he'd ever known. Sarah's hand remained in his as they watched the last light fade from the sky, the stars emerging with brilliant clarity. In the Montana darkness, the wild horses settled for the night, their shapes becoming shadowy forms against the darkened landscape. Yet even in the darkness, Ethan could sense Phantom's watchful presence, the remarkable animal who had carried a simple leather satchel to a grieving man's door and, in doing so, had set in motion changes neither could have foreseen. The object the wild horse had brought that October morning had contained a man's identification and personal belongings. But what it truly contained, what had truly shocked Ethan Miller and changed his life, was a demonstration of the capacity for intelligence, compassion, and connection that existed beyond human understanding. A reminder that the boundaries between species, between wild and tame, between known and mysterious, were far more permeable than humanity had imagined. In saving a lost hiker, in bringing a reclusive man back to life, in leading his wild kin to sanctuary before danger arrived, Phantom had delivered a message more profound than words could express. That the natural world was filled with intelligences humans had only begun to comprehend, and that healing often came through unexpected messengers who crossed boundaries we believed impermeable. As Ethan and Sarah sat together in companionable silence, the sanctuary settled into night routines around them. Yet even in darkness, the presence of the wild horses remained, a constant reminder of the extraordinary bridge that had been built between worlds and the remarkable animal who had shown the way. Autumn painted the Montana landscape in burnished gold and fiery crimson as the second anniversary of Phantom Sanctuary approached. Ethan Miller stood at the edge of the expanded property, gazing across meadows now dotted with grazing wild horses. The transformation of Ridgeline Ranch into a nationally recognized Mustang Conservation Center had exceeded even his wildest expectations. What began with one remarkable horse bringing a leather satchel had evolved into a refuge for over 70 wild Mustangs, a research facility drawing equine behaviorists from universities worldwide, and a model for a new approach to wild horse management that was being studied by government agencies across the West. The morning air carried the first hint of winter's approach, crisp and clean against Ethan's weathered face. He'd aged visibly. In these 2 years, more silver threading through his dark hair, deeper lines etched around his eyes, but there was a vitality to him that had been absent during his years of isolation. Purpose had changed him as profoundly as grief once had. "Morning," Sarah called, approaching on horseback rather than her usual truck. She rode Willow, a gentle bay mare who had been among the first rescues from the modified BLM roundup. Unlike most of the sanctuary's residents who remained essentially wild, Willow had shown a clear preference for human companionship and willingly accepted a saddle. The film crew is setting up by the north pasture. They're hoping to catch the morning light on the herd. Ethan nodded, watching as Sarah dismounted with practiced ease. Their relationship had deepened gradually over these 2 years, evolving from professional collaboration to friendship to something more significant that neither felt the need to label. They maintained separate residences. Sarah still ran her own ranch adjacent to the expanded sanctuary, but their lives had become thoroughly intertwined through their shared mission. The network executives called again, Sarah continued, falling into step beside him as they walked the perimeter fence. They're very excited about the documentary, talking about prime-time slots, international distribution. Ethan made a non-committal sound. The attention still made him uncomfortable, though he'd grown better at managing it. The documentary project that had begun as a small, independent film about Phantom's extraordinary behavior had attracted major network attention after. Early footage began circulating among wildlife filmmakers. What was supposed to be a modest educational piece had expanded into a feature-length exploration of wild horse intelligence and the revolutionary approach to conservation that Phantom's sanctuary represented. "Have they settled on a title?" he asked, more to show interest than from any real concern. "The Messenger is still the front-runner," Sarah replied, "though they're also considering The Impossible Horse and Between Two Worlds." Ethan's gaze drifted to where Phantom grazed with his immediate family band, his 3 mares and their offspring, now including 5 young horses born at the sanctuary. The dappled stallion's coat had developed more silver over these years, adding distinction to his already regal bearing. Age suited him, bringing a deeper gravity to his watchful presence. As if sensing Ethan's attention, Phantom raised his head, dark eyes finding the humans across the distance. After a moment's consideration, he broke from his family and approached the fence with that deliberate grace that had become so familiar. The stallion no longer needed to prove his extraordinary intelligence. It was evident in everything from his problem-solving abilities documented by researchers to his complex social management of the sanctuary's multiple herds. But still, he never failed to surprise. "Good morning, old friend," Ethan greeted softly as Phantom reached the fence. The wild horse acknowledged him with a gentle huffing breath, then extended the same greeting to Sarah, who had earned his complete trust over time. "He knows it's a special day," Sarah observed. "Sometimes I swear he understands everything." Ethan nodded, no longer finding such suggestions implausible. 2 years of careful observation and interaction had convinced him that Phantom's cognitive abilities extended far beyond what conventional science recognized as possible for equines. The research being conducted at the sanctuary, non-invasive, studies involving observation and voluntarily participation, was challenging long-held assumptions about animal intelligence and communication. "The journalists arrive at noon," Sarah reminded him. "The piece in National Geographic really stirred up interest. And James is bringing that state senator who's been working on the wild horse protection bill." Ethan sighed. Despite his lingering discomfort with publicity, he had come to accept its necessity. The sanctuary's operations, the expanded land purchases, the research programs, all required substantial funding. And beyond the financial considerations, sharing Phantom's story had helped shift public perception of wild horses from picturesque symbols to intelligent beings deserving of protection and respect. "I'll be ready," he promised. Sarah's hand found his, squeezing gently. "You always are, even when you'd rather be anywhere else." They continued their morning rounds in companionable silence, checking water sources and monitoring the various family bands that now called the sanctuary home. Unlike traditional captive situations, the Mustangs here maintained their natural social structures and behaviors. The sanctuary's innovative approach involved minimal human intervention beyond ensuring adequate resources and occasional veterinary care. The horses remained wild, making their own choices about territory and movement within the expanded boundaries of the protected land. As they approached the visitor center, once a simple shed, now a substantial structure housing educational, exhibits and research facilities, Ethan noticed the gathering of staff and volunteers preparing for the day's special event. The second anniversary celebration would bring supporters from across the country, along with media representatives and government officials interested in the sanctuary's groundbreaking approach to conservation. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the behavioral ecologist who had established a permanent research outpost at the sanctuary, waved as they approached. "Morning, Ethan, Sarah. We've got the new cognitive testing station ready to demonstrate today. The network producers are particularly interested in Phantom's problem-solving abilities." Ethan nodded, though he felt a familiar protective instinct rise at the mention of testing. "As long as he chooses to participate," he reminded her, unnecessarily. Dr. Vasquez had been instrumental in developing the sanctuary's ethical research protocols, where all studies were designed around voluntary participation by the horses. "Of course," she assured him with a smile. "You know our approach by now. We've set up the puzzle boxes with the Apple rewards, but it's entirely up to him whether he engages, though given his track record, I suspect he'll solve the new sequence faster than we anticipate." The previous studies had documented Phantom's remarkable ability to solve complex mechanical puzzles to access food rewards, tasks that required multiple steps of planning and memory. More impressive still were the instances where he had appeared to deliberately teach these solutions to other horses in his band, demonstrating a form of cultural transmission previously undocumented in wild equines. The results from the latest study are causing quite a stir in behavioral science circles, Dr. Vasquez continued as they walked toward the main building. "We've documented cognitive abilities that challenge the traditional hierarchy of animal intelligence. The implications go far beyond wild horse conservation." Ethan understood the excitement. The accumulating evidence suggested that horses, particularly wild Mustangs like Phantom, who had developed in complex natural social structures, possessed cognitive abilities far more sophisticated than previously recognized. Their capacity for abstract thinking, causal reasoning, and even what some researchers were cautiously terming theory of mind, had profound implications for how humans understood and treated these animals. Senator Morrison's aide called to confirm their arrival. "Time," said Marcus, the sanctuary's operations manager, as he joined their small group. "And the Canadian wildlife officials will be here around 2. They're very interested in adapting our model for their Mustang management programs." Ethan nodded, accepting the updated schedule Marcus handed him. The sanctuary's approach, creating protected spaces where wild horses could maintain their natural behaviors while receiving minimal necessary support, was drawing attention from conservation agencies worldwide. The traditional management methods of roundups, holding facilities, and adoption programs were increasingly recognized as both costly and ethically problematic. "Everything's ready in the main presentation room," Marcus continued. "James did a final check on the audio-visual system this morning. The footage from the tracking collars is particularly impressive. Shows how the family bands utilize different territories throughout the seasons." The non-invasive tracking program had been James Harrington's contribution to the sanctuary's research efforts. After his recovery from the ordeal that had first brought Phantom into their lives, James had dedicated himself to developing wildlife monitoring technology that provided valuable data without causing stress or harm to the animals. His wilderness experience had transformed him from a casual weekend hiker to a passionate advocate for conservation. As noon approached, Ethan retreated briefly to his cabin, still the original structure, though now supplemented by modern amenities, to prepare for the public aspects of the day ahead. Through the window, he could see the first journalists arriving, cameras and equipment being unloaded under the direction of the sanctuary's media coordinator. A knot of tension formed between his shoulders, the familiar discomfort with attention that had never fully dissipated despite 2 years of practice. A soft knock at the door preceded Sarah's entrance. She had changed into more formal attire, though still practical for the ranch setting, a crisp blue shirt, dark jeans, and her best leather boots. She assessed him with a knowing look. "Hiding out while you still can?" she asked, her smile taking any sting from the words. "Gathering my thoughts," Ethan countered, though he returned her smile. 2 years, Sarah. Sometimes I can hardly believe it. I know." She moved to stand beside him at the window, their shoulders touching in comfortable familiarity. From a recluse with one old horse to the director of an internationally recognized conservation center, it's quite a journey. Ethan's gaze drifted to the framed photograph on his desk, the first clear image ever captured of Phantom, taken the day after the wild stallion had brought the leather satchel that changed everything. In the photo, the Mustang stood at the edge of the property, his intelligent eyes focused on the camera with an intensity that still sent shivers down Ethan's spine. "None of it would have happened without him," Ethan said quietly. "Without whatever impossible intelligence led him to bring me that satchel, to trust me with his herd." Sarah's hand found his, fingers intertwining with practiced ease. "Some things defy explanation, but that doesn't make them any less real or important." Ethan squeezed her hand gently, grateful for her presence, for her unwavering support through the challenges and triumphs of building the sanctuary. Together, they had navigated bureaucratic hurdles, funding crises, and the complex logistics of creating a new model of conservation. Their partnership had been the steady foundation upon which everything else rested. "We should go," Sarah said after a moment. "The cameras await, and Senator Morrison is notoriously punctual." With a resigned nod, Ethan followed her outside, pausing briefly on the porch to survey what had once been his isolated refuge. The transformation still astonished him. The expanded facilities, the carefully designed pasture systems, the research stations, and most importantly, the dozens of wild horses moving freely across the protected landscape. What had begun with one man's grief and one horse's extraordinary act had grown into something that was changing how humans understood and protected these magnificent animals. The afternoon unfolded in a whirlwind of interviews, presentations, and guided tours. Ethan moved through it with practiced patience, sharing the sanctuary's story and mission while directing attention whenever possible to the research findings rather than his personal journey. Dr. Vasquez presented the latest cognitive studies, Marcus outlined the innovative land management approaches, and James demonstrated the non-invasive tracking technology. Throughout it all, the wild horses continued their normal activities, some curious about the visitors, others maintaining a dignified distance. Phantom, as always, seemed to understand the significance of the occasion. The dappled stallion made a regal appearance at the cognitive testing station, solving the new puzzle sequence with efficient precision while cameras captured every move. He then led his family band in a graceful circuit of the main viewing area, before retreating to the more private sections of the sanctuary. His performance, if it could be called that, seemed perfectly calculated to impress the visitors while maintaining his essential wildness and dignity. Senator Morrison, a square-jawed woman with decades of political experience, observed it, all with keen attention. "Remarkable," she commented as she and Ethan walked along the observation pathway later in the afternoon. "Truly remarkable. And you say this all began with that stallion bringing you a hiker's personal belongings?" "It did," Ethan confirmed, having long since grown accustomed to the incredulity that the origin story typically provoked. Phantom found James Harrington injured in the wilderness and somehow not only helped keep him alive, but eventually sought human assistance by bringing me identifiable items. The senator shook her head in wonder. "If I hadn't seen the documentation, the witnesses, it's almost beyond belief." "Many aspects of animal intelligence remain beyond our full understanding," Ethan replied diplomatically. "What we're learning here is that wild horses in particular have cognitive and social capabilities far more complex than previously recognized. And that has significant implications for management policies," the senator observed, shifting smoothly to the political dimensions. "The traditional roundup and holding facility model is not only increasingly expensive, but potentially causes trauma to animals with this level of intelligence and social structure." "Exactly," Ethan agreed. "The sanctuary model we've developed here offers an alternative approach, protected landscapes where natural behaviors can continue with minimal human intervention. It's more cost-effective long-term and more ethically sound." "Your timing is fortunate," Senator Morrison said, as they completed their circuit of the observation path. "With the federal wild horse management budget under review and several key wildlife protection bills coming up for vote, success stories like this carry significant weight. I'd like to bring a congressional delegation here next month, if that would be possible." Ethan nodded, recognizing the opportunity to influence policy at the highest levels. "We'd be honored to host them." As the official activities concluded and the visitors began departing, Ethan found a moment of quiet near the original pasture where it had all begun. The setting sun cast long shadows across the land, gilding the autumn landscape in warm light. He was tired. These public events always drained him, but satisfied with how the day had unfolded. The sanctuary's story had been shared, connections with influential supporters strengthened, and most importantly, the wild horses had continued their lives with minimal disruption. The soft sound of hoofbeats drew his attention. Phantom approached. Through the golden light, his dappled coat shimmering with each deliberate step. The wild stallion had developed an uncanny ability to find Ethan whenever he sensed the man needed companionship, another behavior that defied conventional understanding of equine cognition. "You put on quite a show today," Ethan said softly, as Phantom reached the fence, dark eyes regarding him with that familiar intelligent awareness. "Made quite an impression on the senator." Phantom huffed softly, blowing warm breath that fogged slightly in the cooling evening air. He extended his neck across the fence, not seeking treats or attention, but offering connection in his own terms. It was a gesture he rarely made, especially after a day of so much human activity. Ethan reached out slowly, allowing his hand to rest lightly against the stallion's powerful neck. The touch lasted only moments before Phantom stepped back, maintaining the boundary that kept him wild rather than tame. But in that brief connection, Ethan felt the unique bond that had developed between them, a relationship built on mutual respect rather than domestication or control. "Thank you," Ethan said simply, knowing the words were inadequate for all that this extraordinary animal had brought into his life. The rescued hiker, the sanctuary, the research breakthroughs, the conservation model, and perhaps most importantly, the restoration of his own connection to life after years of isolation and grief. Phantom regarded him steadily for another moment, then turned with deliberate dignity and trotted away to rejoin his family band as darkness began settling over the valley. Ethan watched him go, still humbled by the privilege of witnessing such remarkable intelligence and spirit. "There you are," Sarah's voice came from behind him. "Everyone's left except the film crew. They're getting some final sunset shots." Ethan turned to find her approaching with 2 steaming mugs. She handed him one, coffee with a hint of whiskey, their traditional end to these eventful days. "Successful day," he acknowledged, accepting the mug gratefully. "Very," she agreed, coming to stand beside him at the fence. The senator seemed genuinely impressed, and Dr. Vasquez is practically floating after Phantom's performance with the cognitive tests. Said he solved the new sequence faster than any previous subject in their comparative studies. Ethan sipped his coffee, letting the warmth and subtle burn of whiskey ease the tension from his shoulders. "He was just here," he said after a moment. "Phantom. It's like he knows when these events matter, when his presence can make a difference." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. After 2 years of witnessing the stallion's extraordinary awareness, little about his behavior could shock her anymore. The researchers can call it what they want: advanced pattern recognition, social intelligence, whatever scientific terms help them categorize it. But we know there's something more happening here. Something science doesn't have adequate language for yet, Ethan agreed. The evidence of Phantom's unusual cognitive abilities had accumulated steadily over the years, from his initial rescue of James to his apparent understanding of human conversations, his problem-solving abilities, his teaching behaviors with other horses, and his seemingly deliberate communications with certain humans. The scientific papers documented the observable behaviors while carefully avoiding more controversial interpretations, but those who worked closely with him knew that conventional explanations fell short. As twilight deepened into dusk, lights began illuminating the sanctuary buildings dotted across the property. From their vantage point, Ethan and Sarah could see the research center where Dr. Vasquez and her team would work late into the night, analyzing the day's observations. The visitor center where the final educational tour had concluded, the volunteer housing where dedicated helpers from across the country stayed while contributing their time and skills. What had begun as one man's isolated homestead had evolved into a community united by purpose. "I had a call from that wildlife rehabilitation center in Wyoming," Sarah said after a comfortable silence. "They're sending 3 more Mustangs next week. Young stallions separated from their band during that illegal roundup in Thunder Basin. Their veterinarian thinks they'll integrate well with the bachelor group in the North Pasture." Ethan nodded. The sanctuary had become a recognized placement option for wild horses recovered from improper handling or illegal activities. Their approach of maintaining natural social structures and behaviors had proven remarkably successful for rehabilitating traumatized Mustangs. Marcus mentioned the new water system for the East expansion is finally approved, he replied. "Once that's in place, we'll have capacity for another 20 or so if needed." The conversation drifted naturally to the practical details of sanctuary operations, the lifeblood work that continued regardless of special events or media attention. As the stars emerged in the clear Montana sky, they walked slowly back toward Ethan's cabin, discussing water rights, winter feed supplies, and the ongoing negotiations for a conservation easement on adjacent federal land. The rhythms of their partnership had become as natural as breathing, each complementing the other's strengths. When they reached the cabin porch, Sarah paused, her expression turning more serious in the warm light spilling from the windows. "There's something I've been meaning to discuss with you. The board meeting yesterday, there was a proposal I wanted to run by you first." Ethan raised an eyebrow, setting his empty mug on the porch railing. "Sounds ominous." "Not at all. she assured him. It's about expansion, not just of land, but of mission. The success we've had here with wild horses has attracted attention from other conservation groups. There's interest in adapting our model for other species facing similar challenges. What species? Initially, the focus would be on other wild equids, zebras, Przewalski's horses, but eventually the approach could extend to various large mammals who need protected space with minimal human intervention. The core concept remains the same, creating environments where natural behaviors can continue while providing necessary resources and protection. Ethan considered this, leaning against the porch railing. The sanctuary had already evolved far beyond his initial vision. This would represent another significant expansion of scope and responsibility. What would it mean practically for us, for this place? More partnerships, more research collaboration, the possibility of satellite sanctuaries using our model, additional funding sources, certainly, but also more complexity. Sarah moved to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his. It would cement Phantom's sanctuary as not just a unique success story, but the foundation of a new conservation paradigm. Named for a horse who broke all our preconceptions about what animals can understand and do, Ethan observed quietly. Exactly. Sarah's hand found his in the darkness. You don't need to decide tonight. The board wanted me to introduce the concept, see how you felt about it. Ethan's gaze drifted to where the wild horses were settling for the night, visible as shadowy forms in the moonlight. Somewhere among them, Phantom maintained his watchful guardianship over the bands that had found refuge here. The dappled stallion had changed not only Ethan's life, but potentially the future of conservation for his entire species. I think, Ethan said slowly, that Phantom would approve of his legacy extending to help other animals. Sarah's smile was visible, even in the dim light. I think so too. Later that night, after Sarah had returned to her own ranch with plans to return in the morning, Ethan sat alone on his porch, contemplating how thoroughly his life had transformed in the 2 years since a wild horse had appeared carrying a leather satchel. From isolation to connection, from emptiness to purpose, from one aging horse to responsibility for dozens of wild mustangs, and possibly, in the future, other species in need of the same approach to conservation. The night was clear, stars blanketing, the Montana sky with brilliant clarity. In the distance, a wolf howled, one of the pack that maintained territory adjacent to the sanctuary lands. After a moment, another answered, voices twining in the darkness. The natural rhythms of the land continued, wild and beautiful, a complex tapestry of life that humans were only beginning to fully understand and respect. From the pasture came the soft sounds of horses moving in the night, a nickering greeting, the gentle rhythm of hooves on earth. Ethan closed his eyes, listening to the symphony of his expanded world. If someone had told him 3 years ago that a single encounter with a wild Mustang would not only bring him back to life, but potentially change the future of conservation, he would have dismissed it as fantasy. Yet here he sat, surrounded by the evidence of that extraordinary journey. The object Phantom had brought that October morning, a simple leather satchel containing a lost hiker's belongings, had seemed mysterious enough. But the true mystery, the true gift, had been what that initial act revealed about the capacity for intelligence, compassion, and connection that existed in a species humans had often underestimated. In seeking help for an injured human, Phantom had demonstrated cognitive abilities that challenged scientific understanding. In returning with his herd, in choosing to build a bridge between wilderness and sanctuary, he had helped create a new model for how humans might protect and coexist with wild species. As Ethan finally rose to enter his cabin for the night, he paused for one last look across the moonlit landscape that had become Phantom's sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, perhaps even new directions for the mission that had given his life renewed purpose. But the foundation would remain the same: respect for the wild, protection without control, and the recognition that humans still had much to learn from the remarkable animals with whom they shared the planet. And somewhere in the starlit pastures, a dappled stallion with intelligent eyes maintained his watchful vigil, the messenger who had carried not just a leather satchel, but a profound revelation about the possibilities that existed when different worlds found ways to connect. 5 years to the day since Phantom first appeared at Ridgeline Ranch carrying a leather satchel, winter came early to Paradise Valley. The morning dawned with a crystalline clarity, frost silvering the meadows and painting delicate patterns. On the cabin windows, Ethan Miller stood at his familiar post on the porch, watching the first light illuminate the expanded sanctuary that had become his life's work. Steam rose from his coffee mug, mingling with his breath in the crisp air as his eyes tracked the movement of horses across the snow-dusted landscape. The sanctuary had grown beyond anything he could have imagined that October morning, when a wild horse changed the course of his life. What began as 40 acres of rocky soil now encompassed over 2,000 acres of protected land. The handful of wild mustangs that had first sought refuge had expanded to nearly 200 horses living in natural family bands. More remarkably, the model pioneered here had been replicated in 7 locations across the West, with international programs adapting the approach for threatened equine populations in Mongolia, Namibia, and Australia. Ethan's gaze settled on the original pasture where it had all begun. There, moving with unhurried dignity through the frost-covered grass, was Phantom. The dappled stallion had aged with grace, his coat now marked with more silver, particularly around his eyes and muzzle. Yet he maintained his regal bearing, his alert intelligence, and his central role in the social dynamics of the sanctuary herds. Researchers had documented his remarkable longevity as a band stallion, a status younger males would typically challenge in wild settings, but which seemed accepted without question among the sanctuary horses. The sound of tires on gravel announced Sarah's arrival. Her truck pulled up beside the cabin, and she emerged bundled against the cold, a manila envelope tucked under one arm. After 5 years, their relationship had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Though they maintained separate homes, Sarah's ranch adjoined the sanctuary's eastern boundary. They shared almost every aspect of their daily lives, their partnership extending far beyond the professional collaboration that had first brought them together. "Morning," she called, joining him on the porch and accepting the second mug of coffee he'd prepared in anticipation of her arrival. "Quite the anniversary. Hard to believe it's been 5 years." Ethan nodded, his eyes returning to where Phantom grazed. "Some days it feels like yesterday. Others, it seems like he's always been part of my life." Sarah followed his gaze, her expression softening. "He looks good this morning. Dr. Vasquez says his latest checkup showed remarkable health for a stallion his age." The sanctuary's veterinary program had been designed to respect the wild nature of its residents while providing necessary care. Most health monitoring occurred through non-invasive observation and the collection of samples from the environment. Only when clearly needed did the medical team intervene directly, and always with methods designed to minimize stress. Phantom, however, had gradually accepted more direct veterinary attention, another of his extraordinary adaptations that defied typical wild horse behavior. "The package arrived this morning," Sarah said after a moment, handing him the manila envelope. "Federal Express, special delivery." Ethan accepted it with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. The envelope contained the advance copy of The Messenger, the documentary that had grown from a small independent film to a major production. After years of filming, interviews and editing, it was scheduled to premiere next month on an international nature channel with theatrical screenings planned for major cities across the country. They're calling it a landmark exploration of animal cognition, Sarah continued, watching as Ethan examined the envelope without opening it. The producer said the test audiences were profoundly moved, as long as they got the story right, Ethan murmured. His initial reluctance about the project had gradually shifted to cautious support as he recognized the documentary's potential to change public perception of wild horses and their management. Still, he harbored concerns about sensationalism, about Phantom being portrayed as a curiosity rather than a being deserving of respect. "They did," Sarah assured him, her hand squeezing his arm gently. "I reviewed the final cut last week when you were in Washington. They stayed true to the science while honoring the mystery. Phantom comes across as neither a parlor trick nor a fictional character, just an extraordinary animal whose actions challenged our understanding." Ethan nodded, tucking the envelope under his arm. He would watch it later when he could process it privately. Today was about honoring the anniversary in a more personal way. "Ready for the rounds?" he asked, setting his empty mug on the porch, railing. Together they began their morning inspection of the sanctuary, a routine that had evolved over the years as the property expanded. They drove Sarah's truck along the network of minimally maintained access roads, stopping to check water, systems, boundary fencing, and the various family bands spread across the protected landscape. The sanctuary's design allowed the horses to maintain their natural movements and social structures, with human infrastructure kept to the necessary minimum. As they approached the eastern section, the most recent addition to the protected land, Sarah pointed toward a rise where several horses stood silhouetted against the morning sky. "Look there. That's Phantom's son with his new band." Ethan followed her gesture to where a young stallion, strikingly similar to Phantom with the same dappled coat but lacking the silver of age, stood watchfully over 3 mares and their foals. Echo, they had named him, the first colt born to Phantom's band after their arrival at the sanctuary. Now mature, he had established his own family in a pattern documented by researchers as remarkably similar to his father's leadership style. The genetic studies came back, Sarah mentioned as they watched the young family band. Dr. Jennings says Phantom's lineage shows markers from some of the oldest Mustang bloodlines in the region. His genetic diversity is exceptional, probably why his offspring show such strong traits. The non-invasive genetic research program had been one of the sanctuary's most valuable scientific contributions, using hair and manure samples collected without disturbing the horses. Researchers had mapped the genetic heritage of the sanctuary herds, documenting bloodlines that traced back to the original Spanish horses brought to the Americas centuries before. The findings had strengthened protection efforts by establishing the historical and biological significance of these wild populations. Their inspection complete, they returned to the main compound where the sanctuary's daily operations were already in full swing. The visitor center opened at 10, admitting limited groups for educational tours. The research facilities hummed with activity as scientists from 3 universities continued their long-term studies of horse cognition, social structures, and ecological impacts. The rehabilitation center, built 3 years earlier, housed newly rescued Mustangs transitioning to the sanctuary environment. James Harrington, whose rescue had started it all, waited for them near the education building. After his recovery, James had joined the sanctuary's board of directors and eventually become its educational director, sharing his remarkable story with visitors and developing programs that brought school children from across the state to learn about wild horse conservation. The wilderness experience that had nearly claimed his life had instead given it new purpose. "Morning, you two," James greeted, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. Once gaunt from his ordeal, he now radiated health and energy. "Quite a day, isn't it? The memorial is ready whenever you are." Ethan nodded, a tightness forming in his chest at the mention of the day's main event. Though the anniversary celebrated Phantom's arrival and all that had followed, it would also mark a more solemn commemoration, one he had been preparing for, but still approached with deep emotion. "We should head over," Sarah said gently, reading his hesitation. "The staff and volunteers are gathering now." Together they walked to a small rise overlooking the original pasture where Phantom had first brought the leather satchel 5 years before. A gathering of people stood there. Sanctuary employees, long-time volunteers, researchers who had become friends, neighbors who had supported the project from its earliest days. At the center stood a simple monument of local stone that had been installed the previous week, covered now by a cloth that rippled slightly in the morning breeze. As Ethan approached, faces turned toward him with expressions of respect and shared purpose. These people, many once strangers, now an extended family, had helped build something remarkable from one extraordinary encounter between a man and a wild horse. Their commitment to the sanctuary's mission had transformed not only this landscape, but potentially the future of wild horse conservation across the West. Dr. Elena Vasquez stepped forward, her scientific precision balanced by genuine warmth. "We thought you should do the honors," she said, gesturing to the covered monument. "After all, none of us would be here if not for what happened 5 years ago today." Ethan swallowed hard, emotion threatening to overwhelm his usual reserve. He looked out across the pasture where Phantom now stood, as if aware of the gathering. The wild stallion had separated from his band and moved closer to the assembled humans, his dark eyes fixed on the proceedings with that impossible awareness that still sometimes sent chills down Ethan's spine. With a deep breath, Ethan stepped forward and gently removed the covering cloth, revealing the polished stone monument. Embedded in its surface was a bronze plaque bearing the sanctuary's official emblem, the silhouette of a wild horse with head raised in dignity and an inscription that had been carefully crafted over many discussions. Phantom's Sanctuary, founded October 12th, 2022. When a wild horse brought more than an object, he brought understanding. May we forever honor the intelligence, compassion, and freedom of the wild ones who share our world. Alongside the text was a perfect impression of a horse's hoof, cast from a track Phantom had left in soft clay near the visitor center earlier that year. Not a brand or a marking of ownership, but a voluntary imprint, a signature of sorts from the being who had inspired it all. 5 years ago today, Ethan began, his voice growing steadier as he addressed the gathered community. A wild horse appeared on my property, carrying a leather satchel. That seemingly impossible act not only led to saving a man's life, but began a journey that brought all of us here today. He paused, looking out to where Phantom stood watching. Since that day, we've learned so much about the remarkable intelligence and social complexity of wild horses. We've developed new approaches to conservation that respect their nature while ensuring their future. We've challenged scientific assumptions and government policies, but perhaps most importantly, we've created a community, both human and equine, united by respect for the wild spirit that defines these magnificent animals. The gathered staff and volunteers nodded in agreement, many having dedicated years to building the sanctuary's programs. Researchers who had documented Phantom's extraordinary cognitive abilities, veterinarians who had developed new approaches to caring for wild horses without domesticating them, educators who had shared the sanctuary's story with thousands of visitors. This monument, Ethan continued, stands not just as a marker of our beginning, but as a commitment to our future. The understanding that Phantom brought us, that wild animals possess intelligence and awareness far beyond what we once recognized, guides everything we do here. It's the foundation of our research, our education programs, and our advocacy work. As if responding to his words, Phantom let out a soft, nickering sound that carried clearly across the morning air. Several people exchanged glances, still amazed even after years by the stallion's apparent comprehension of human events. Dr. Vasquez had documented dozens of instances where phantoms seemed to understand human conversations, responding appropriately to questions or demonstrating behaviors precisely when they were being discussed. The scientific papers documented the observable phenomena while carefully avoiding anthropomorphic interpretations. But those who worked closely with him had long since accepted that conventional explanations fell short. The work we've done together these past 5 years has already changed lives, Ethan concluded, his voice strengthening with conviction. Not just for the nearly 200 horses who call this sanctuary home, but for thousands more who are now managed with greater understanding and respect because of what we've learned and shared. That legacy continues to grow as our model spreads to new locations, as our research informs policy, and as our visitors carry the story of Phantom and his remarkable intelligence back to their communities. When the ceremony concluded, the gathering gradually dispersed, returning to the day's responsibilities. As director of both the sanctuary and its research foundation, Ethan had meetings scheduled throughout the afternoon, budget reviews, research, proposals, discussions about the documentary premiere. But before diving into those obligations, he made his way down to the pasture fence, where Phantom waited with that patient dignity that had become his hallmark. "Thank you for indulging us," Ethan said quietly as he approached. The wild stallion's ears flicked forward, dark eyes regarding him with the intelligent awareness that still sometimes took Ethan's breath away. 5 years of ceremonies and visitors and researchers. Not what you signed up for when you brought me that satchel, I imagine. Phantom huffed softly, shifting his weight in what Ethan had come to recognize as the equine equivalent of a shrug. Despite years of intensive scientific study, the full extent of Phantom's comprehension remained impossible to quantify. The cognitive tests had demonstrated problem-solving abilities far beyond previously documented equine capabilities. The social observations had revealed complex communication and teaching behaviors. But the personal interactions, the moments when Phantom seemed to respond directly to human words, to anticipate needs, to make decisions that factored in human considerations, those remained in the realm of anecdote rather than proven science. "We're doing good work here," Ethan continued, needing to express his gratitude even if the precise level of Phantom's understanding remained uncertain. "Your family is safe. Others like you are being treated with more respect because of what people have learned here. That object you brought me that day, it started something important." Phantom regarded him steadily, then did something that still had the power to move Ethan deeply after all these years. The wild stallion deliberately lowered his proud head, extending it across the fence in a gesture of connection that he offered. To very few humans, it wasn't submission. Phantom had never been broken or domesticated, but a voluntary bridging of the space between their worlds. Ethan reached out slowly, placing his hand gently against the stallion's forehead. The touch lasted only moments before Phantom raised his head again, maintaining the dignity and independence that defined him. But in that brief connection, Ethan felt the extraordinary bond that had developed between them. A relationship unlike any he had experienced before or expected to again. With a soft, nickering sound, Phantom turned and trotted back to his waiting family band. Ethan watched him go, still humbled by the privilege of knowing such a remarkable being. After 5 years of daily interaction, the wild stallion remained exactly that, wild, choosing his own path, maintaining his essential nature while accepting certain humans into his sphere of awareness and occasional contact. "Ready for the foundation meeting?" Sarah asked, joining him at the fence. She'd given him space for the private moment with Phantom, understanding its importance. Ethan nodded, reluctantly turning away from the pasture. "The Washington trip went well," he said as they walked toward the administration building. "Senator Morrison thinks the new protection bill has enough support to pass this session. That would be quite an anniversary gift," Sarah remarked. 5 years from a leather satchel to federal legislation protecting wild horse territories. The journey from that first morning to the present had indeed been remarkable. What began as one man's encounter with an extraordinary horse had expanded into a movement, changing how wild Mustangs were perceived and managed across the country. The sanctuary's research had been cited in congressional hearings, its approaches adapted by federal agencies, its educational materials used in schools nationwide. The afternoon unfolded in a series of meetings, progress reports on various sanctuary programs, updates on the documentary launch plans, discussions about upcoming research publications. Throughout it all, Ethan maintained his focus on the practical decisions that kept the sanctuary functioning, that ensured its mission continued to evolve and expand. But part of his awareness remained with the dappled stallion who had made it all possible, who continued to challenge human understanding of what animals could comprehend and communicate. As evening approached, Ethan finally found time to return to his cabin and open the package containing the advance copy of The Messenger. He settled into his familiar chair by the fireplace, Sarah beside him, and started the documentary that would soon share Phantom's story with millions of viewers. Worldwide, the film began not with Phantom himself, but with sweeping aerial footage of wild horses running across the western landscape, narration explaining their historical and ecological significance. Then it shifted to Ethan's original 40-acre property. As it had been 5 years earlier, isolated, rundown, a refuge for a man who had withdrawn from life following personal tragedy. The contrast with the current sanctuary, shown in parallel shots, was striking. As the documentary unfolded, it wove together multiple perspectives, James Harrington describing his survival in the wilderness and Phantom's seemingly impossible assistance. Dr. Vasquez explaining the scientific significance of the behaviors documented at the sanctuary. Wildlife managers discussing how the sanctuary model was changing approaches to conservation. Volunteers sharing their experiences working with the wild horses. Throughout it all ran the central narrative of Phantom himself, the remarkable stallion whose intelligence and actions had challenged scientific understanding and inspired a new approach to protecting his kind. "They did get it right," Ethan acknowledged as the film concluded 2 hours later. The documentary had avoided both excessive sentimentality and cold scientific detachment, presenting instead a thoughtful exploration of the complex intelligence demonstrated by Phantom and the profound questions it raised about human relationships with wild animals. Sarah nodded, her hand finding his in the dim light. It tells the true story, that sometimes the most important messages come from messengers we least expect if we're open to receiving them. That night, after Sarah had returned to her own home, with plans to return in the morning, Ethan stood on his porch gazing across the sanctuary that had grown from one extraordinary encounter. The full moon illuminated the landscape, casting the grazing horses in silver light and shadow. Near the original pasture, he could make out Phantom's distinctive form, standing slightly apart from his band, head raised as if keeping watch over his extended family. 5 years had transformed both the landscape and the man who had once sought isolation there. The sanctuary had grown from a desperate act of rescue to a model changing how humans understood and protected wild horses. The research conducted here had challenged scientific assumptions about animal cognition and communication. The educational programs had shifted public perception of Mustangs from romantic symbols to intelligent beings deserving of protection and respect. All because a wild horse had somehow known to bring a leather satchel to a grieving man's door. As the anniversary day drew to a close, Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The object Phantom had carried that October morning, a simple leather satchel containing a lost hiker's belongings, had initially seemed mysterious enough. But the true mystery, the profound gift, had been what that action revealed about the intelligence, awareness, and capacity for connection that existed in a species humans had often underestimated. In the years that followed, that revelation had expanded through countless demonstrations of Phantom's extraordinary cognition, his problem-solving abilities, his apparent understanding of human conversations, his teaching behaviors with other horses, his seemingly deliberate communications with certain humans. The scientific papers documented the observable phenomena while carefully avoiding more controversial interpretations. But those who worked closely with him knew that conventional explanations fell short. The truth that Phantom had brought was more profound than any physical object could contain, that the boundaries between human and animal intelligence were far more permeable than science had recognized. That connection could span the divide between domesticated and wild, that healing often came through unexpected messengers, crossing boundaries we believed impenetrable. As Ethan finally turned to enter his cabin for the night, his gaze lingered one last time on the distant silhouette of the dappled stallion illuminated by moonlight. "Thank you," he whispered, the words carrying on the night breeze across the sanctuary that bore Phantom's name and would continue his legacy long after both man and horse had returned to the earth they shared. The wild stallion raised his head as if hearing the whispered gratitude, moonlight gleaming on his silver-touched coat. For a moment, horse and man regarded each other across the distance, two beings whose unlikely connection had changed not only their own lives, but potentially the future of conservation for an entire species. Then Phantom turned and moved with deliberate dignity to rejoin his family, disappearing into the moonlit landscape that was neither fully wild nor truly tame, but something new that honored both worlds. Inside his cabin, Ethan paused before the framed object that held the place of honor on his wall, the original leather satchel that Phantom had carried 5 years before. Weathered by time but preserved as a reminder, it represented not just the beginning of an extraordinary journey, but a profound truth about the capacities that existed beyond human understanding. The object a wild horse had brought to a lonely farmer had contained identification and personal belongings that led to saving a human life. But what it truly contained, what had truly shocked the man who received it and changed his life forever, was a demonstration of intelligence and compassion that transcended the boundaries humans created between themselves and the natural world. A reminder that sometimes the most profound messages arrive through unexpected messengers, if we have the wisdom to recognize and honor them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.